Lenox Avenue was never truly loud. It hummed, shoes on pavement, low conversations, a radio playing somewhere behind a half-open window, the clink of glass bottles being restocked behind a counter that had seen 30 years of hands slide coins across it. The grocery store sat halfway down the block like it always had, narrow, deep, smelling faintly of oranges, flour, and old wood. Mr. Kaplan stood behind the counter with his sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows, stacking canned beans into a pyramid that no one would notice but him. He liked order. He liked things staying where they belonged. That was when the door opened too hard. The bell above it didn't ring. It clanged. Four young men walked in like they owned the air. Loud jackets, loud laughter. That restless energy of boys who wanted to be seen before they were respected. They weren't buying anything. They were performing. One grabbed a soda from the cooler and cracked it open without paying. Another kicked the bottom of a bread crate like it had insulted him. The third leaned on the counter and grinned too wide. The fourth didn't speak. He watched. Mr. Kaplan didn't say anything at first. He had seen this before. Noise that passed through like weather. If you didn't react, it usually moved on. He went back to stacking. That was when she came in, slowly, carefully, an elderly woman with a gray coat buttoned all the way up, though the air was warm, a scarf wrapped tight around her head, a paper list in her hand, folded so many times it looked like fabric. She closed the door gently behind her. The bell rang the way it was supposed to. She nodded to Mr. Kaplan without smiling. He nodded back, the way people who had shared a neighborhood for decades do. No words needed. She moved toward the produce with the patience of someone who did not rush for anyone anymore. The boys noticed her because she didn't notice them. One of them stepped sideways into her path. "Hey, Grandma," he said, dragging the word out like a joke that had already gone stale. She didn't respond. She tried to move around him. He stepped again. "Where you going in such a hurry?" The others laughed. Not loudly, just enough. She lifted her eyes once, not afraid, not angry, just tired of having to look at foolishness. "I just need potatoes," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, steady. The one leaning on the counter watched this with a grin. "Potatoes ain't going nowhere," he said. "You got all day." The boy with the soda took a long sip and said, "You gotta pay toll to pass through here." They laughed again, still soft, still ugly. Mr. Kaplan stopped stacking. He didn't sigh, he didn't curse. He simply placed the last can down, wiped his hands on a small white cloth, and stepped out from behind the counter. Not fast, not slow, measured. He walked past the candy rack and stood 3 feet from the boys. "You don't need to talk to her like that," he said. His voice was calm, almost bored. The boys turned. The one blocking her path looked at Mr. Kaplan like he had just remembered he existed. "Mind your business, old man." "This is my business," Mr. Kaplan replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point. He didn't threaten. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, shoulders straight. "You can joke outside," he said. "Not in here." The one with the soda tilted his head. "You kicking us out?" Mr. Kaplan nodded once. "Yes." Silence settled in the store in a strange way, not tense, just heavy. The boys weren't used to being told no without anger attached to it. They were used to shouting matches, to fear, to someone escalating so they could escalate back. But this man wasn't giving them anything to push against, just a wall. The quiet one finally spoke. "You know who we are?" Mr. Kaplan looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said. "And I don't need to." That was the moment the laughter died. The boy in front of the woman stepped aside, but not out of respect, more out of confusion. She walked past him without looking at any of them, straight to the potatoes. She picked them one by one, checked each carefully, placed them into a small paper bag. Her hands did not shake. Behind her, the boys stood still, unsure how to turn this into a performance now. Mr. Kaplan pointed gently toward the door. "Take the soda with you," he said. "You already opened it." The one holding it stared for a second. Then, without another word, they walked out. Not defeated, not triumphant, just dismissed. The bell rang again. Soft this time. The store felt different after they left, as if something invisible had been pushed back into place. Mr. Kaplan returned behind the counter. The woman came forward with her potatoes, a loaf of bread, and 2 onions. She placed them down carefully. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. He waved it away with a small motion of his hand. "You shop here," he said. "That's enough." She paid in exact change. Coins counted slowly. When she turned to leave, she paused. "You shouldn't have done that," she said gently. Mr. Kaplan shrugged. "They were loud," he replied. "I don't like loud." She studied his face for a moment, as if deciding whether to say something else. She didn't. She simply nodded and walked out into the sunlight of Lenox Avenue. The door closed behind her with that same soft ring of the bell. Mr. Kaplan went back to his pyramid of beans. Outside, 2 men sitting on a stoop across the street had watched everything through the glass. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't need to. They both recognized the woman, and they both knew something Mr. Kaplan did not. One of them exhaled slowly. "Lord," he muttered, because the woman who had just bought potatoes was Bumpy Johnson's mother. Lenox Avenue did not gossip. It observed, and then it remembered. By the time Bumpy's mother had reached the corner, the story had already left the grocery store without moving its feet. 2 men on a stoop watched her pass like they were seeing a headline walk by. They didn't call out. They didn't wave. They just lowered their voices. That was her. "I know." And Kaplan. "I know." Across the street, a woman leaning out of a second-floor window had seen the boys crowd her in the store. She hadn't heard the words, but she had seen the shape of the moment. Seen Mr. Kaplan step out from behind the counter. She disappeared back inside before the woman even crossed the sidewalk. Not to hide, to tell. Inside barber shops, stories didn't need volume. They traveled in fragments. "You hear what happened?" "With who?" "On Lenox. Kaplan's store." "What about it?" "Some boys." His mother. The clippers didn't stop buzzing, but every man in the chair met his own eyes in the mirror at the same time. Nobody smiled. Nobody joked. Because this wasn't funny. This was delicate. Respect had been touched. And Harlem understood the weight of that better than any outsider ever could. By noon, the story had reached 3 corners, 2 stoops, a church basement, and a card table where dominoes suddenly sat untouched. Not one version of the story was loud. No one exaggerated. No one added drama. They didn't need to. The facts were enough. Young boys, disrespect, Kaplan stepping in, Bumpy's mother walking out unharmed. That was all, and somehow it was everything, because Harlem knew 2 things at the same time. First, those boys had no idea who they were playing with. Second, Mr. Kaplan had no idea who he had just protected. That was the part that made people uneasy. He hadn't done it for Bumpy. He had done it because it was right, and that meant something different. On Lenox, reputation usually protected people before anyone else had to. But this time, a man had stepped in without knowing he was standing in front of a storm. An old man at the newspaper stand folded his paper slowly. "Kaplan don't deserve trouble," he said to no one in particular. A younger man nearby replied quietly, "He won't get trouble." The old man looked at him. "You sure about that?" The younger man nodded once. "Depends how Bumpy hears it." That was the real question moving through Harlem now. Not if Bumpy would find out, but how. Because information did not reach Bumpy Johnson the way it reached other men. It did not come through panic. It did not come through noise. It arrived arranged. By the time it reached him, it would be clean, precise, without emotion, and that made it more powerful. A woman carrying groceries paused on the sidewalk and shook her head gently. "Those boys picked the wrong day," she murmured. Her friend replied, "They picked the wrong woman." By early afternoon, people had started passing Kaplan's store slower than usual. Not staring, just noticing. He didn't see it. He was inside, arguing quietly with a supplier over the price of tomatoes, like nothing in the world had shifted. But outside, Harlem had already begun bracing for something that had not yet happened, because everyone knew Bumpy Johnson had one rule that was never spoken, but always understood. You could insult him, you could challenge him, you could even fight him, but you never touched what he loved, and his mother. She wasn't just family, she was sacred. A teenager sprinted down the block carrying a message that wasn't written anywhere. He wasn't told to run. He just felt like he should, because somewhere in Harlem, someone who worked for someone who worked for Bumpy had already heard the first version of the story, and they were deciding whether to pass it upward. Carefully, respectfully, without urgency, because urgency implied danger. And this wasn't danger. This was something else. This was a matter of principle. And principle, in Bumpy's world, required thought before action. The sun moved across the sky like it always did. Traffic crawled. Vendors shouted. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of Lenox Avenue, a quiet awareness settled in. People began waiting for a reaction that had not yet begun, not in fear, but in curiosity. Because Harlem had seen Bumpy angry, they had seen Bumpy ruthless, they had seen Bumpy silent, but this was different. This wasn't about territory. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about pride. This was about respect given to his mother by a man who didn't know who she was. And that kind of thing. That kind of thing Bumpy Johnson never forgot. By late afternoon, the message was finally on its way to him. Not rushed, not dramatized, just carried by a man who understood the weight of every word he was about to say. And all across Lenox Avenue, people felt the same quiet thoughts settle into their minds at the same time. Kaplan had done the right thing. Now they were about to find out what the right thing meant to Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson did not like being interrupted. Not because he was important, but because interruptions usually arrived carrying emotion, and emotion clouded information. He preferred things clean. He sat near the window of the back room at the St. Nicholas Park numbers office, jacket off, sleeves rolled, glasses low on his nose, a ledger open in front of him, columns of numbers lined up straighter than soldiers. Outside, children ran past laughing. Inside, the room was quiet enough to hear pencil on paper. 3 men sat around a small table playing cards without speaking. The slow rhythm of cards touching wood filled the space like a clock ticking. That was when the door opened. No one knocked, but no one ever knocked here. They entered carefully, one of Bumpy's runners, young, respectful, the kind that never spoke unless spoken to. He stood just inside the doorway. "Mr. Johnson." Bumpy didn't look up yet. "Yes." The young man waited, choosing his words, knowing this was not something to say quickly. "There was a situation this morning, on Lenox." Bumpy turned a page in the ledger. "What kind of situation?" "Your mother was at Kaplan's grocery." That made Bumpy's pencil stop. Not drop, not tremble, just stop moving. He lifted his eyes slowly over the rim of his glasses. "She all right?" "Yes, sir." A pause. Long enough for the room to understand this was now the only conversation that mattered. Bumpy closed the ledger gently, folded his hands on top of it. "Tell me." And the young man did, not adding color, not adding anger, just facts. Boys in the store, talking foolish, blocking her way. Kaplan stepping in, asking them to leave, your mother walking out without trouble. When he finished, the room felt different, heavier. Bumpy leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window. Not at anything specific, just into distance. No one spoke. The card game had stopped without anyone realizing it. Finally, Bumpy asked one question. Kaplan know who she is? No, sir. Bumpy nodded once. A small motion, almost invisible. And the boys? They didn't know either. Another nod. Silence returned, but this time it wasn't empty. It was thinking. Bumpy reached for his glasses, removed them, and set them on the table beside the ledger. He rubbed the bridge of his nose slowly. Not from stress, from consideration. One of the men at the card table shifted slightly, waiting for instruction that didn't come. Because Bumpy Johnson never reacted immediately to things that involved respect. Respect required precision. Where is my mother now? Bumpy asked. At home. She didn't say anything to nobody. A faint smile touched the corner of Bumpy's mouth. That sound like her. He stood up, not abruptly, deliberately. Walked to the small sink in the corner and poured himself a glass of water. Drank half, set it down. Still no orders. Still no anger. Just a man placing pieces of a situation where they belonged. Finally, he spoke. Send somebody to sit outside Kaplan's store tonight. The young man nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Not for trouble, Bumpy added. For watching. Yes, sir. Bumpy turned back toward the table. And find out who them boys are. No tone change, no threat in his voice. Just instruction, the kind that carried more weight because it was quiet. One of the older men finally asked, carefully, You want us to bring them in? Bumpy shook his head once. No. That answer surprised them more than anger would have. Bumpy walked back to the chair but didn't sit. He rested his hands on the back of it. Kaplan, he said softly, almost to himself. He been on that block longer than some of y'all been alive. Nobody spoke. He didn't step in for me, Bumpy continued. He stepped in because it was right. The room listened like students. That's different. He finally sat down again, opened the ledger, picked up his pencil, as if the conversation had ended. But before anyone could relax, he added one more sentence. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to buy some groceries. That was it. No explanation, no elaboration, just a statement. But every man in that room understood something important had just been decided. And it wasn't violence. It was something far more deliberate. Something Harlem would talk about without ever raising its voice. The young runner nodded and left the room quietly. The card game resumed, but no one really played. They were thinking about Kaplan, about the boys, about what it meant when Bumpy Johnson said he was going grocery shopping. Outside, the late afternoon light fell across Harlem like it always did, but inside that small room, a decision had been made that would move through Lenox Avenue without a single shout. Because when Bumpy Johnson moved calmly, Harlem paid very close attention. Morning on Lenox arrived gently. Vendors setting up fruit stands, delivery trucks double parked with engines coughing smoke into the cold air, church ladies walking in pairs, speaking softly about nothing in particular. Kaplan unlocked his store like he always did. Same key, same stiff turn in the lock, same bell test when he pushed the door open and let it ring once to make sure it still worked. He did not know Harlem had woken up early to watch his sidewalk. Men who didn't shop there stood across the street pretending to read newspapers. A woman lingered at a bus stop she didn't need. Two teenagers leaned against a lamppost without talking. They weren't guarding. They were witnessing. Because word had traveled the night before in that quiet Harlem way that felt less like rumor and more like preparation. Kaplan stepped behind his counter and began counting the register. He noticed the watchers. He assumed they were waiting for the bus. At exactly 9 minutes past 9, The street changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just subtly. Conversations paused mid-sentence. A fruit vendor stopped mid-arrange. A man lighting a cigarette forgot to inhale. Heads turned in the same direction at the same time. Bumpy Johnson was walking down Lenox Avenue. Alone. No entourage. No hurry. Hat tilted slightly forward. Coat pressed flat like it had been ironed by someone who cared. Hands relaxed at his sides. He walked like a man with nowhere urgent to be. But everyone watching knew. This was the destination. Kaplan looked up from his register when the bell rang. Soft, respectful. He saw a well-dressed man step inside and close the door gently behind him. Kaplan nodded politely. Morning. Bumpy nodded back once. Morning. His voice was low, even, the kind that didn't travel far but didn't need to. Kaplan recognized the face. Not personally, but from newspapers, from whispers, from the way people said the name without saying it. He felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, recognition. Bumpy walked slowly down the first aisle, studying the shelves as if he had never seen canned goods before. He picked up a jar. Read the label. Put it back. Kaplan watched him the way a man watches weather approach, trying to guess what kind of day this was going to be. Bumpy brought a few items to the counter. Bread, potatoes, onions, the same things his mother had bought the day before. He placed them down carefully. Kaplan's hands felt suddenly too large as he reached for the paper bag. He didn't speak, neither did Bumpy. The street outside had gone still enough that people could hear the faint rustle of paper as Kaplan folded the top of the bag. Finally, Bumpy looked at him. You own this store a long time. Kaplan cleared his throat. 32 years. Bumpy nodded slowly. That's a long time to be standing in one place. Kaplan gave a small, unsure smile. I like knowing where things are. Bumpy's eyes rested on him for a moment longer than comfort allowed. I heard about yesterday, he said. There it was. Kaplan's fingers paused on the bag. I didn't mean no trouble, he said quickly. They were just being disrespectful, and I... Bumpy raised his hand gently, not to silence him harshly, just to slow him down. I know exactly what you did. Kaplan swallowed. I'd do it again. Bumpy nodded once. I know that too. Silence filled the space between them, thick but not hostile. Outside, people leaned slightly forward without realizing it. Bumpy reached into his coat pocket. Kaplan stiffened, but Bumpy did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a folded handkerchief, laid it on the counter, then he placed his hand on top of it. My mother, he said calmly, does not like being a burden to anybody. Kaplan shook his head quickly. She wasn't... I know, Bumpy said. Always that same tone. Controlled, measured. She raised me to understand something important. Kaplan waited. That respect ain't loud. It's quiet. It shows itself when nobody watching. Kaplan's eyes softened. I was watching, he said gently. Bumpy studied him. Then, very slowly, Bumpy did something no one on Lenox Avenue had ever seen him do inside a business. He removed his hat, held it in his hand, and nodded his head slightly toward Kaplan, a gesture so small it almost disappeared, but outside people gasped softly when they saw it through the glass. Because Bumpy Johnson did not lower his head to many men. Thank you, Bumpy said. 2 words. Kaplan blinked, confused. You don't have to. Yes, Bumpy replied quietly. I do. He reached into his coat again. This time, he pulled out money. A thick fold. He placed it on the counter. Kaplan stared at it. That's too much, he said. It's not for the groceries, Bumpy replied. Kaplan didn't touch it. Then what is it for? Bumpy looked around the store slowly, at the shelves, the floor, the old wood counter. For you staying right, he said. Kaplan shook his head. I can't take that. Bumpy leaned in slightly, not threatening, just present. You can, he said softly, and you will. Kaplan hesitated. Why? Bumpy's eyes held his. Because Harlem needs to see what happens when a man does the right thing for no reason. Outside, the silence on Lenox Avenue felt almost sacred now. People weren't watching a confrontation. They were watching a lesson. Kaplan finally placed his hand over the money. Not greedily, reluctantly. Bumpy picked up the paper bag of groceries, placed his hat back on his head, and before turning to leave, he said one last thing. If anybody ever bothers you in here again. He paused, not for drama, for meaning. They bothering me. Then he walked out. The bell rang softly behind him. Kaplan stood frozen for several seconds, hands still resting on the money, heart beating louder than the street outside. Through the window he saw something he had never seen before. People weren't staring at Bumpy in fear. They were looking at him with something else, respect, and something close to gratitude, because Bumpy Johnson had just done something Harlem would never forget. Without raising his voice, without raising his hand, he had raised the standard. Bumpy did not go straight home. He walked, slow, unhurried, the paper bag resting easily in the bend of his arm, like this was any other morning. But Lenox Avenue was not breathing normally. People stepped aside before he reached them, not because they were afraid to be near him, but because they didn't want to interrupt the weight of what had just happened. Men who had known Bumpy for 20 years watched him pass with new eyes, not surprised, but reminded, because power, when it stays quiet, becomes easy to forget. And Bumpy had just reminded Harlem what real power looked like. Across the street from Kaplan's store, the four boys from the day before stood near a fire hydrant. They had come back, not to cause trouble, to understand what they had stumbled into. They had heard the whispers that morning, seen the way people looked at the store, felt the strange attention settling on that sidewalk. They didn't know why, until they saw him walk out. The paper bag, the hat, the calm. One of them swallowed hard. That's him, he said. The quiet one nodded. They all felt it at once. The cold realization that yesterday had not been small. They hadn't disrespected an old woman. They had brushed against something sacred without knowing it. Bumpy saw them before they decided whether to leave. He didn't change direction, didn't speed up. He walked straight toward them, each step measured like a metronome. The boys stood still. No one ran. Running would have made this worse. Bumpy stopped in front of them, close enough that they could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. He looked at each of them one by one. No anger, no heat, just assessment. You boys from around here? He asked calmly. They nodded. Yes, sir. Sir. The word came out before they could stop it. Bumpy glanced toward Kaplan's store briefly, then back to them. My mother was in there yesterday. Silence. Thick and choking, the boy who had blocked her path lowered his head. Yes, sir. Bumpy waited. He didn't rush them. He let the weight of the moment settle fully into their bones. You know why that man stepped in? Bumpy asked. They shook their heads. Because he thought she was alone, Bumpy said. The boys said nothing. And you made her feel like she was. The words weren't loud, but they hit harder than shouting ever could. The boy with the soda spoke quietly. We didn't know who she was. Bumpy nodded once. I know. He paused. That's why you still standing here. They looked up, confused. Bumpy shifted the grocery bag slightly in his arm. If you had known, he continued, and did it anyway, this conversation would be different. A breeze moved down Lenox, lifting dust from the sidewalk. No one on the street pretended not to watch now. This wasn't private. This was instruction. Bumpy looked at the boy who had stepped in her way. You got a mother? Yes, sir. She shop around here? Yes, sir. Bumpy nodded toward Kaplan's store. Tomorrow, you go in there. You carry her groceries home. The boy blinked. Yes, sir. All of you, Bumpy added. For a week, they nodded quickly, grateful for something to do. Grateful this was not something else. And you apologize to Mr. Kaplan, Bumpy said. Not for me. For you. Yes, sir. Bumpy studied them one last time. This neighborhood ain't yours to test, he said quietly. It's yours to protect. The words landed in a place they would remember long after fear faded. Then Bumpy did something even stranger. He reached into the paper bag, pulled out one of the potatoes, and handed it to the boy in front. The boy stared at it, confused. Carry something, Bumpy said, so you remember the weight. He turned and walked away without another word. The boys stood there holding a single potato like it was a brick. Across Lenox, people exhaled slowly. Because what they had just witnessed was not punishment. It was correction, and correction lasts longer. Inside Kaplan's store, he watched through the glass, unable to hear but understanding everything. His eyes grew wet without him noticing, because he realized something that made his hands tremble slightly on the counter. Bumpy Johnson had not come to protect his reputation. He had come to protect the neighborhood's standards, and that was why Harlem felt different that day. Not tense, not afraid, but aligned. For the rest of the afternoon, people moved through Lenox Avenue with a strange softness in their steps. They spoke a little quieter. They held doors a little longer. They looked at elders a little differently. Because the lesson had not been shouted. It had been shown. And when something is shown calmly, it sinks in deep.